In Chapter 7, we looked at firms that have some market power. That is, they face a downward sloping demand curve and they can choose the point to produce on that demand curve that maximizes their profit. Um, we saw that in those markets, the outcomes are generally not Pareto efficient because there are trades that could make both sides better off. In reality, some firms, I don't know about many firms, some firms are price takers. And that means that they don't have power to change their price. If they raise their price above the market price, nobody will buy from them. And there's no incentive to lower the price because they're already selling as much as they can at that market price. And so what we're going to look at is sort of how their behavior differs from price setting firms, what the efficiency is with perfect competition, and sort of how realistic this type of market is. So the special case of perfect competition is really when we have a lot of price-taking firms, a lot of customers, and the goods or services are identical. So that's going to happen when firms usually are producing identical goods like commodities. So if you are growing corn or soy or wheat, or you are producing aluminum or steel, then you're producing a commodity and your good is the same as your competitor's goods, and so in which case you may have very little market power. And so we'll look at some of these similarities and differences between price-taking firms in which they do not have market power and price-setting firms that we looked at in Chapter 7 who do have market power. So recall from Chapter 7 that we have a demand curve, and the demand curve doesn't really change when we're looking at perfect competition. We can still think of the demand curve as the willingness to pay of all of the customers. And so this is an example where we're looking at the secondhand textbook market. And so if the price is 15, then there are 10 customers who are willing to buy. If the price is 10, that increases to 20. If the price is 5, that increases to 30. We have a downward sloping demand curve because at each price, more people are willing to buy whatever good it is. We can think of the secondhand textbook market, if we're thinking about one textbook, as a market with potentially lots of buyers and lots of sellers and an identical good, right? You all need that Econ 201 textbook. So we have a downward sloping demand curve that represents the willingness to pay. And then we have an upward sloping supply curve. And so then the question is, well, what does that supply curve represent? And the best way to think about it is it's the amount that all of the firms in the market, or even potentially in the market, are willing to sell given each price. And so as the price goes up, right, on the vertical axis, firms are willing to sell more, or more firms are willing to sell. So in this case, at a price of 4, we have a quantity of about 7. At a price of 8, we have a quantity of a little over 20. At a price of 10, we have a quantity of 32. So we have an upward sloping supply curve, which we can think of as a willingness to accept of firms. And sellers may have different reservation prices, right? And in this case of used textbooks, it just means, well, how much is this used textbook worth to me? If it's worth $20 to me, then I'm not going to sell at $10. But if it's only worth $5 to me, then I will sell at $10. We can also think of it in terms of, the price that firms, or the cost that firms have to pay to produce the good, and that could be upward sloping as well. So not surprisingly, when we think about our model of supply and demand, we put those two curves together. So we've got price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And the point at which they cross, labeled A here, is the point at which there is no excess supply, no excess demand. Every seller finds a buyer, every buyer finds a seller. And so that means that everybody who's willing to buy at this price P star finds a book, and every seller who's willing to sell at P star finds a buyer. Now, there are still some buyers down here who are only willing to sell for less than P star. They don't, buy for less than P star. They don't actually find a book at that price because that's below the market price. And there are some sellers up here who are willing to sell at above the equilibrium price P star. They don't find a buyer, but at that point, at P star Q star, every buyer who's willing to pay that price finds a seller. That's the equilibrium market clearing price where there's no excess demand and no excess supply.